So, we're going to start off this week talking about some of the major art and design movements of the late 1800s in Europe and going up until kind of the mid 1900s. And so, first, let's think about what graphic design was prior to like the late 1800s. Really, design wasn't in existence because nobody had any money to spend. That was one reason. There was most people had nothing and they lived day to day, and they were just every cent they had went towards their survival. And so the only time design was really necessary or something was put out to communicate to large audiences was when there was a public decree or a new law or a general announcement that was important for the town or the city. And in 1776, there were these things called broadsides, which were these pieces of paper that were printed on one side. And there wasn't much thought that went into the design of them. But if you could read and you saw one of these kind of pasted up on a wall where people kind of congregated, then you would read it. And that's what design was. That's what people were, how people were communicating at the time. But then, of course, the world starts to change dramatically in the 1800s. The mechanical revolution was occurring, industrial revolution, and the world was suddenly being influenced by other geographic regions. There was the invention of photography, which for the first time people could actually see photographs of things, events, people, objects, buildings that they had never been able to see before, which was quite amazing. And borders were opening, and people were being inspired, and were really being taken kind of visually to a whole new level because of this ability to see things for the first time. And for example, Japan had these amazing prints that started to show up in France. And these prints really influenced Impressionist painters that were living in France at the time. And this is in the mid 1800s. And these painters were Degas, Henry Toulouse-Lautrec. And what also was occurring was because there was kind of this, for the first time, a sort of emerging middle class that had money to spend. So products started to pop up, cigarettes and nightclubs, and people were actually able to spend money for the first time. They had a little bit more money to spend. And so what happened is these places that wanted to advertise, a nightclub, for example, would hire a fine artist to do a design for them, and then they would print the posters and put them up all over the city, all over Paris. And then people would see them and then come to the nightclub. So the early subject matter dealt mainly with kind of Parisian nightlife, theaters, cafes. And these posters were so beautiful and so popular that they were stolen off the walls as soon as they were hung. And another thing that happened at the time was this thing called the three-stone lithographic process. And it was more sophisticated and offered kind of a higher range of tones. And because of that, people were able to uh, print really these beautiful color prints that they hadn't been able to print before. And so this is the first time the Art Nouveau movement was like late 1800s, early 1900s, was really the first major artistic style in which mass produced graphics started to appear. So Art Nouveau, it has a meaning. It means new art in French. And what you can see as we kind of look through some of these beautiful posters is that it's all about kind of natural form. There's lots of flowers and plants, beautiful women, curved lines, and it really kind of replaced the more academic art of the 19th century. It's very sensual. It's highly stylized. If there was type in the design, it's usually hand drawn and very ornate. Ideas of women were shifting. This style really emphasized nature and beauty. Sometimes local celebrities of the time, singers, would be placed in the designs. This is, I think her name's Sarah Bernhardt, and she was a famous kind of actress slash celebrity in Paris at the time. So, uh, this style is, some people kind of consider it the beginning of true graphic design. And what I want you to do as you kind of think about it this week is I want you to look at how this influenced some of design today. So you can see this style in modern graphic design. And we're going to look at another movement today, and that's the psychedelic movement. And what's kind of interesting is if you look at the psychedelic movement that was occurring in America in the 1960s and you look at Art Nouveau, there's some real similarities between the two movements. So you can kind of think about that. And if you're trying to choose between two movements to kind of compare and contrast, you might choose the psychedelic movement and the Art Nouveau movement because of the similarities. So illustration, you can see kind of the effects of Art Nouveau on illustration, the sensuality. And, as Art Nouveau kind of spread throughout Europe, it kind of changed. There was kind of localized tendencies as it geographically spread, and there was a artist slash designer, Charles Rene Mackintosh, who took his inspiration from Scottish traditions and kind of blended them with this Art Nouveau style. And his work can be seen today in Glasgow, Scotland. And he kind of created the Glasgow School of Art, and it's really his architectural masterpiece. And his style and details can be seen all over the place in windows, doors, and he has a famous tea room that you can visit there. And it's a little bit different. You can kind of see how, with his style, there's more of this sort of emphasis on the geometric form, rectilinear form. You see more squares, more of a grid-based pattern. Often you'll see roses and flowers, but they're a little bit different. And this is his famous tea house, which is just amazing. Every detail in it is inspired by him. And this is the front of the Glasgow School of Art. And this is just a gate that you can see and inspired by the Art Nouveau style. And so it's really considered a total art style because it affected architecture, interior design, jewelry, and it really, was kind of seen as a way of life more than just one style. And so these rich, well-off Europeans would live in these Art Nouveau inspired houses. That had everything in them kind of with an Art Nouveau spin. So there would be silverware and lamps, and we'll look at some of this stuff as we kind of go through this lecture here. And this is Charles Rene Mackintosh's alphabet that he created. It's really beautiful. The numbers are really beautiful. Here's a lamp. Fine artists obviously were inspired. So this is Gustav Klimt. This is another poster, and you can see how ornate that is. And really, there were these great international exhibitions taking place at the time. Probably for the first time in history, millions of people were coming together. The Paris World Fair of 1900 was kind of the largest event of that type to ever occur. And this philosophy of the style, this way of life, and this optimism was being generated by all of this new technology and this changing world. And just the buildings, the beauty, the intricate detail. If you ever get a chance to go to Barcelona and to see the architecture, it is just amazing, some of the detail. This is a lamp. You can see this is kind of a hutch where you would put plates. This is it's kind of a part of probably a powder room. That seat is just amazing. This is a bed, obviously. And so just kind of going through, you see how all-encompassing this was. So Futurism, or the Futurist movement, was a movement started in Italy before World War I. And this movement was really radically different than the last movement, Art Nouveau, that we looked at. And in this movement particularly, artists were looking forward to the future. They wanted to really destroy all museums and art of the past and really celebrate everything modern, the machine, the city, noise, energy, and even war. And you can see here with this book, it was a radically different style, and they were doing some very innovative things with typography. And they practiced in every medium of art, including painting, sculpture, ceramics, graphic design, industrial design, urban design, interior design. And it glorified modernity and aimed to kind of uh, liberate Italy specifically from the weight of its past. And so there was this rise of nationalism and fascism that was occurring. And if you ever get the chance to read the book Fall of Giants, it's really interesting to see how these um, ideas of the elite or the establishment were changing, and how this whole social movement was occurring in Europe that was kind of bringing these whole societies down. And this was one of the movements that was really responding to that. And so, expressive typography, and specifically, I want you to look at this movement for the innovations in type that were occurring, because they were really breaking the traditional rules of layout. And that's how I want you to kind of approach this movement, because you'll see when you look at the fine art, the painting, that it's a radically different style in painting, but it's more important for us as graphic designers to look at how it affected type, I think. So if you explore this movement, look at these typographic designs and think about how different they were, and how they were really making people think and approach text as shape, kind of like what we were doing in some of our earlier projects. So it really influenced many other 20th century art movements, including constructivism, surrealism, Dada. These are all movements we're going to look at. And it also, has influenced our Western culture. If you ever get a chance, watch the movie Blade Runner. And there's a lot of things in Blade Runner that are kind of reminiscent of the style of this movement and the ideas behind Blade Runner, and kind of this technology, speed, power, futurism is really interesting. And so futurism kind of introduced the use of a manifesto as a public means to advertise an artistic philosophy. And it was a weapon. They were using it as a weapon against the kind of academic and conservative world, and wanting to really change society. And we'll kind of go in here and look at some of the urban. This is an urban illustration. And then here's some of the fine art. You can kind of see the style here. There was really bold use of color. And so other movements were occurring kind of simultaneously or kind of at the later end. And so Dada was one of those movements that started around 1915. And it was a revolutionary art movement that began in Germany in the early 20th century. And Dada was kind of an artistic and literary movement. And it was really it arose because the World War I and nationalism that many people thought led to the war were influenced by other avant-garde movements, kind of cubism, futurism, constructivism, expressionism. And its output was wildly diverse, ranging from performance, art, poetry, photography, sculpture, painting, collage. And it kind of mocked um, the aesthetics of fine art, and it mocked materialistic and nationalistic attitudes. So it kind of proved a powerful influence on artists in many cities, because the movement was really about being um, opposed to everything. And so it was very conceptual. And in this movement, the focus of the artist was not on kind of crafting aesthetically pleasing objects, but on making works that often kind of made people think and made people question society and the role of the artist and even the purpose of art. And so these members of Dada were just opposing all norms of bourgeois culture. And so it's sometimes they even scream, Dada is anti Dada. So they were kind of anti everything. And there were these famous things called ready-mades, and these were made popular by Marcel Duchamp. And what happened was he would take famous works of art, like the painting of the Mona Lisa, and he would really degrade it by painting or coloring in this goatee under her nose. And this made people furious. This degrading of a famous work of art was seen as so disrespectful. And then he would take things like this urinal and he would place it in a gallery, and or put other everyday objects and kind of not really do anything to them, just put them in a gallery. And it really kind of forced questions about artistic creativity and the very definition of art and its purpose in society. So it was making people think. And so, really, the only rule in Dada is to break all known rules. And it was also focused on performance. And this was a famous performance by Hugo Ball, where he dressed up in this crazy costume where he kind of looked like the Tin Man, and he kind of recited nonsensical poetry. And even in the typographic design, you can see how it's not intentionally doing anything but making you look. And so if you look at this style, really you do look at it. It's not beautiful, but it is engaging, and it makes you kind of look and think. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Bauhaus movement. The Bauhaus movement was around 1919 to 1933, and it was a design school founded in Weimar, Germany, by the architect Walter Gropius. And the school was really all about melding techniques and materials. And so they would include glass, concrete, steel, chrome, and they were really kind of rethinking the aesthetics of design. And so there were lots of new experiments in design, especially in architecture, but also in painting and sculpture, that came from this movement. And you can also see influence in furniture, textiles, and dinnerware. And you can still see a lot of this stuff today if you go to stores like West Elm, the furniture store West Elm. And some of the most famous designs for chairs, tables, stacking stools, lights, textiles, and dinnerware are still in use today, coming from this movement. And so Gropius really aimed to teach Bauhaus students the coexistence of modern style, machine processes, manual work, construction, and good design. And they wanted to instill a clear aesthetic in a new generation of design students that began with a 6-month basic program. So this is kind of a schematic of the program and what they would learn in those 6 months. And this is an image of the school. And so you can kind of see the architecture, and this is very modern. Here's another image. And here's some of the furniture. And you can see up here, this is a table by Charles Rene Mackintosh. And this George Nelson table here is something that I've seen personally in a store. So I think if you go out there and look, you'll be able to see this style and this aesthetic and how it's really kind of transcended and is still in use. This movement really inspired some fine artists. This is Joseph Albers, and he was a colorist, and he did these studies in color. And this is from an artist. His name's, I think, Finnegar, and this was used to advertise the Bauhaus School. So this was a woodcut, actually, that was turned into a poster to advertise this movement. Here's a Bauhaus poster, and one thing you can see about it is it's really starting to use a grid. So when we start talking about Swiss design a little bit later on, Swiss design was influenced by Bauhaus, and it's all about the grid. But Bauhaus was kind of the start of it, where things are lining up. There's not a lot of random placement. There's thought taken into where you're going to put the shapes and the text and how you arrange them. And here's another poster. This is Paul Klee. He's also an artist that was inspired by the Bauhaus movement. And this is the font type Universal. And this was a typeface by Herbert Bayer. And It was commissioned by Walter Gropius, and Gropius wanted to create a typeface for all of Bauhaus, and he wanted it to be modern, and he wanted it to be the ideal type, and the result was universal. And so it's kind of a simple geometric sans serif font. And here's another poster, and you can see the exploration of kind of the angle and the viewpoint, and the the modern feel of the architecture. Here's another great example of a poster. I think this is a poster, and it's really on this grid. Everything's lining up. The edge of the K is kind of meeting the edge of that red line there, and there's kind of a symmetry and balance going on within the space. So Russian constructivism was an art movement that began in Russia in 1913, and it was really emphasizing abstract aspects of composition. And there was also this stress of everyday industrial materials, and they were being used in interesting ways in abstract compositions. And so this is a poster from this time, and it was kind of also a way of the government was changing in Russia. It was, well, Russia had become the Soviet Union. There was a revolution in 1917, and so communism was the new philosophy. And so there was this rejection, or the rejection of the idea of art being autonomous. And the government and the leaders were using art and design as political tools. And they were trying to promote their philosophy of communism. And so you can kind of see this style is all about abstraction. So if you look at some of the imagery, like this is two figures, they're just flattened out and become just pure flat color. There's often a very limited color scheme, one or two colors, sometimes just a color like red and then either gray and black. There's also a lot of use of photography. So they would bring in photographs and sometimes combine photographs with flat color illustrations. And notice the composition of this photo. This is basically a photograph of a worker in a factory, and they're shooting it from a really low angle. And what's happening is it's making the worker look very powerful, greater than life, even. He's so huge, and you're looking up at him. So there was this intent to kind of uh, really make the subject powerful in this movement. I like this poster. So you can kind of see that there's a photograph being used, and then there's some graphical elements in there with the background. And the font was always kind of this thick, blocky sans serif font. And I think this is, I want to say it's Lenin, but it could be Stalin. But you see the way it's photographed, there's kind of this energy occurring where you have, these ordinary people, this mass of ordinary people, and then this political leader who's speaking to them. And you get that kind of red graphical elements almost flowing from him as if they're kind of flowing as he speaks.